Hi guys, Aceface back with another video for you, and today we're going to talk tactics. We're going to talk advanced tyranid tactics, and we're going to home in and focus on the Hive Tyrant. Right guys, so we've got our codex now. We've started to get an idea of the combos. We're looking at what's cool, what's working, what's anti-meta, what's the meta. And in this series of videos I'm going to focus in on some of the key units and how to use them. Now I'm going to assume for these videos you know the basics, you roughly know kind of what's good, you've got an idea of it, and what we're going to talk in these videos is we're going to talk a little bit about advanced tyranid tactics, a bit of advice from the hive mind. So some of this you'll already know, some of this will be useful, some of it won't, but before we get started, if you please could hit that sub button, and if you could like this video, it helps me absolute tons. You can follow me on Instagram, that's where I'm most active. You can also catch up with me on my Facebook page, and if you want to support me further and be an absolute boss, you can go to my Patreon page and become a Patreon. We've got some exciting stuff happening there. Just got some new dice produced, so we've now got 3 colours, 3 beautiful sets of dice that are just in production at the moment, and are exclusive to my Patreon backers. There's also some artwork going on a new t-shirt design, which again at first will be exclusive to Patreon backers. So great opportunity now to kind of become a backer, support me doing what I do. It helps me absolute tons and allows me to get the time to be able to do this. So thanks very much for those that have already backed me. You guys are absolute bosses. But into this video, and let's talk Hive Tyrant. So I'm going to flick onto the page. As I said, I'm going to assume that you know the kind of basics. So what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to focus in on every single little option, but I'm going to talk about the key ones, the ones that are maybe a little bit more obscure, that maybe you're not sure about, and you never know, we might discover some things together as we're kind of going through this. So for a start, what I want to focus on a little bit around why the Hive Tyrant is very good now, and why potentially it was overlooked when 8th edition sort of rocked up, and at first, why did we kind of not think it was necessarily the be all and end all? Well, there was 2 major changes that happened when we went over to the codex, and those 2 huge changes were the Hive Tyrant's toughness and the Hive Tyrant's save, and particularly its invulnerable save. So the toughness went from toughness 6 to toughness 7, and the invuln went from a invuln of 5+ to an invuln of 4+. Now those 2 things in themselves have made the Hive Tyrant a big player in the game. The 4+ invuln means that he very much stands toe to toe with all the best invulns on the whole for all the big guys. So yeah, there's a few people with a 3+ invuln, but majority of the big guys with lots of wounds, guys that hit very hard, their invuln save tends to be a 4+. So that 4+ really puts the Hive Tyrant in contention with the big hitters, with the Primarchs, well, with the Demon Primarchs, and with some of the other cool stuff out there. Which means that in simplest form, you've pretty much, unless you're being hit by mortal wounds, you're always going to have that 50-50 chance of you saving that wound, and that's huge when we're talking about multi-damage weapons. So you know, you're talking about a lot of shooting that potentially does 2 damage each, that does 3 damage each, that does D3, or even potentially they're shooting missiles at you that are doing D6, or las cannons again D6. Having an opportunity to just in one roll stop all that damage getting through is absolutely huge, and the difference between a 4+ and 5+, I don't need to tell you guys, is just massive. So that's one of the reasons why he's such a viable and solid unit. But combined with that toughness 7, and the toughness 7 just means that quite a lot of those weapons that before were maybe wounding him on a 4 and now wounding him on a 5, and so many of those really tough weapons are now wounding him on a 4 or wounding him on a 5. It's not to be underestimated how much that extra toughness helps the Hive Tyrant stay that much more survivable. Points wise, stayed the same, so that was cool. So you know, you're getting a Hive Tyrant at a relatively cheap points, and that's kind of the beauty behind him, because the Hive Tyrant just on its own is a great solid unit. It's a good buffer for your army. It gives you a nice bit of extra synapse because they have an extended synapse range, so it's never a bad thing just to have a Hive Tyrant in your army for that alone. It can do pretty well in combat, but you know, the solid thing about the Hive Tyrant is he's so good for the points, which means that you can take multiple, and that's when we're starting to talk these tactics, guys. That's when we're starting to break this down and look at where the Hive Tyrant starts to get some magic, and that is by taking multiples. So before we go into sort of the tactics of building multiple Tyrants, let's talk about a little bit about the war gear that you've got on the Tyrant. So you can stack your Tyrant in lots of different ways. You can make him all-out combat beast, you can make him all-out shooting, or you can make him halfway in the middle. And again, this will depend on how many you've got and what function you need him to do on the battlefield. So your reliable build is a 50-50 build, and that means taking a set of Devourers, which is 12 shots, pretty good when you're hitting on 3s, strength 6, it's only AP dash, but 12 shots is a great sort of outlay of shooting. That's going to be great at dispatching chaff, but it's also not bad at elite troops as well, because quite often you're going to be wounding on a 3 or even potentially a 2, more likely to be a 3, and you're just making them make saves. So from that point of view, it's good. It's also good because quite often we're going to be facing a -1 to hit, so having 12 shots is not bad. You know that you got a good chance of getting 6 of them through. You'll probably wound with the majority of them, which you're then making your opponent save. And quite often it's just volume of saves is what will bring stuff down in this game and in this edition. So from the start, that's not a bad way to go. And then when you're looking at combat, to kind of even this guy out, so you've got 12 shots from his Devourers, then you want something in there to make him decent in combat so he can stand up. So, you know, the Hive Tyrant's 4 attacks, he has 5 if you include his tail. Now, what you can do with him is you can take a pair of bone swords, that will give him an additional attack. Still pretty nice as well, nice bit of damage output. You can take a bone sword and a lash whip. That's great because it means that he's always going to get to attack, which is cool as well, because potentially your enemy is going to want to kind of dash in with hard hitting units, you know, Blood Angel captains, whatever it might be. Having that lash whip is going to mean that he's still going to get to attack, which is pretty cool. The other great advantage of taking a bone sword and a lash whip is being able to combine that and then turning it into the relic, which is the Reaper of Obliterex, which suddenly means that Tyrant is an absolute beast, doing absolute ton of damage, stacked with some toxin sacks, which we'll go into a little bit later, is going to make that guy really crazy good. So you've got some options there, but the go-to advice for me and the way to run him is with Monstrous Rending Claws. Now the Monstrous Rending Claws are great because of their -3. I'm just going to double check. Yeah, -3. But one of the big things for it is you can re-roll to wound. And you've got an option of rending there as well, doing up to a -6, so they're not going to get a save unless they've got an invuln, and doing, you know, quite a bit of damage there as well. So the Monstrous Rending Claws is the way to go because it's a 3 upgrade, so you don't have to pay any points for it. So you can quite happily then take your shooting 12 shots from your Devourers, and then you've got your Monstrous Rending Claws in there, which are then going to give you some combat bite. And because he's not got tons and tons of attacks, and he's always going to, well, he's not always, but he's hitting on 2s to start off with, that means you're going to reliably get your hits through, but then being able to re-roll your wounds makes him very, very reliable in combat as well. So you're going to get a bit of bang from your buck from his combat abilities, which means then, you know, you've got an opportunity to do a little bit of both, which is, as I said, on the whole, particularly if maybe you're not going to revolve your army around it and you just want 1 or 2 Tyrants, that's the way to go. So you go with 1 set of Devourers and you go with 1 set of monstrous Rending Claws. That keeps him nice and cheap and cheerful, but also means that he's hitting pretty hard in both shooting and in combat. And that is not to mention, of course, the elephant in the room is you want to be taking him with wings. Now the reason why you want to be taking him with wings, and we will talk again a little bit about this tactics as we go through this video, but you want to be taking him with wings because 1, it makes him incredibly fast, really increases that speed, gets him forward. 2, he moves up to 16 inches, which is very, very good, but also he can deep strike in, and that's huge as well, and that's what you're going to be doing more often than not. But as I said, we will go into details with that in a little bit. But so you're going to want to always take wings. You know, there's almost no reason to ever have your Tyrant on foot. Tyrant Guard are too expensive. They're not really good. They're not reliable. You don't want to be taking them. You don't want to be invested in those guys. The range shooting from the most advisory shooting weapons is too short range to be foot slogging as well. You want to be making sure that straight away you're going in, you're causing impact and you're doing damage. These guys are not heavily expensive, so you can afford to not throw them away, but you can afford to throw them into the teeth of danger. 1, they're very tough. 2, they're very reliable. 3, they need to be in there doing damage straight off the bat. So we're always going to take wings. So if you've got a Tyrant and he's on foot, my advice to you is get some wings for him. There's plenty of different ways. You can get Demon Prince wings. You know, there's other third-party manufacturers out there that you can find wings. Whatever it is, you know, find your kids' toys, cut their wings off their favourite toy, and get some wings on them. Because yeah, you want wings on your Tyrant. It's a must-have. I'm afraid. If anyone tells you otherwise, they're probably not telling you straight. So get some wings on your Tyrant. It's the way to go. So you've got your setup there. So you've got wings, you've got some monstrous Rending Claws, you've got some Devourers, and then you've basically then got a couple of little options. You can take Adrenal Glands, you can take Toxin Sacs on these guys. If you can afford it, take both. They're both really, really handy options. The Toxin Sac to give you that extra damage, and the Adrenal Glands just to make sure that when you're charging and you've got those Rending Claws, you're going to be more reliable. You're dropping in 9, now you only need an 8-inch charge rather than a 9-inch charge. That's pretty powerful. That's going to make you a lot more reliable. Using a command point to make sure you're going to get that charge in. Potentially you're going with a high fleet that gives you rerolls, behemoth. You've got options there as well. So if you can afford those 2 upgrades, they're not incredibly expensive. I'd probably try and put them on, but if you're trying to save points, you can afford to leave them at home. If anything, the Adrenal Glands is probably a more important one, particularly if you're deciding to sacrifice a bit of shooting and going for those monstrous Rending Claws. Let's make sure you get that Tyrant in combat, because if he's just standing there waving in the wind, you might as well have taken a second set of guns. So Adrenal Glands of the 2 is probably the one to go for. If you can afford both of them, those Toxin Sacs will definitely help you out 100% and be a good upgrade to go for. Now, that's kind of if you're going to go for one basic Tyrant. If you're going to go for multiple, it's not a bad option to potentially mix it up a little bit and throw in some double Devourer Tyrants. Now the reason why I wouldn't necessarily go down this route if you're just rocking 1, or maybe if you're just rocking 2, is these guys are very 2-dimensional. They are a shooting platform, and they are awesome at doing that. These guys are back to your 7th edition Tyrant. They are literally just doing tons and tons of DACA. They go up to 24 shots, so they are seriously clearing through chaff. And that's what they're there for. If you go double Devourer, their job is to clear your chaff, so you can get other things into the nice stuff, into their nice juicy heart of their army, and you can start doing damage. but that these guys are not going to be able to do anything in combat because they've just lost all their abilities. Yes, they're still hitting on 2s, yes, they're still strength 6, but the reality is there's no AP there, they're not doing any damage. They will do D3 with a tail, but realistically these guys are not scary in combat. They'll still scare your opponent because they're a big model, they're flapping in their face and they're shooting lots of guns, so they're still going to get a little bit of attention, but the reality is these guys cannot hit anything in combat. So if you're going to go with just 1 or 2, it's much better to keep your options open so they can do some damage in combat, because going with double devourers means they are literally just a mobile gun platform. And because they're short range, I mean they're still 18 inches, but the reality is once you've shot at something, if it's not dead, it's probably going to be either shooting you to death or charging you. And if it's charging you, then yes, you've got a 4-up save, which is going to keep you some resiliency there, but if you can't hit them back, that tyrant's potentially in trouble. So that's why if you're just going for 1 or 2, go with a bit of both. But if you're going multiple, then you can hedge your bets a little bit. So you can put these guys in there with double devourers in alongside ones with a bit of combat, and then suddenly what you've got is you've got masses of shooting, because you've got the ones with the 1 set, but now you've got some ones with 2 sets, and quite quickly the amount of shots is racking up incredibly fast. So going for that little combo works really well, particularly say let's say we're going for a moderate spammy tyrant army. So we've got 2 tyrants that have got a couple of sets of devourers, and they've got the monstrous rending claws. Now you've got 1 that's double devourers. Straight away you're suddenly hitting on 48 shots. Great, really good. But you've also then got the ability to do some damage in combat, and then you've got 1 that's maybe hanging back a little bit, still able to kind of get involved if he needs to, tie up a tank, charge in, cause some trouble to a small unit, but he's not going to set the world on fire in combat. But it's not the end of the world because you've got 2 guys that are pretty killy in combat. So that works really nicely. So you can start, once you've got like a platform of at least a couple that have some danger in combat, because you want something to be able to deal with your heavier toughness 8, toughness 7 stuff. They want to be able to deal a bit of damage. But once you've got a couple of them, you can start then going, right, how am I going to build the rest of my army? Am I going to build it all the same? So I'm going to build it all with 1 set and some claws. So actually what I've got is a really combat savvy army with a fair bit of shooting. Or actually what am I going to do is I'm going to make this army really shooty. And that's the way that I would advise. So when we're talking about advanced tactics, what I would say is you don't want too many of these guys that are kind of 50-50. I would go with 2, maybe 3 max, and then everything else you want to go really shooty, because the edition is still a shooty edition, and actually if you can put these guys down, then that's the way to go. Because what you can do with tyrants is you can just apply a ton of pressure by taking out that chaff, by getting in their face, by tying stuff up. You don't even need to kill stuff, you can just tie it up, and then you're going to be winning those games. So for me, your magic number is around 2/3 50-50 builds. The rest you probably want to go shooting. You never really ever want to go an all-out combat tyrant. You're just meaning that you're not playing in all the rounds, and that's one of the beauties of a Hive Tyrant. A Hive Tyrant can play in every single phase of the game. So obviously it's going to play in the movement phase. It's going to play in the movement phase by being either a nuisance, by being incredibly quick, by dropping in where you need to drop in with deep strike, by being able to move on to an objective relatively quickly. So it's incredibly effective in that movement phase, and you can use it to your advantage there. It's got fly because we're always taking it with wings, so don't ever be afraid of jumping out of combat and then jumping onto objective. Or jumping in for a late game line breaker, whatever it might be, you can do that, and that's a great tactic to do because you've got that fly ability. In the psychic phase, we'll come into how you kit out your tyrant, but basically it's interacting within the psychic phase. The shooting phase, we've got some guns there, we can really do some damage, and then in the combat phase we're also great in combat, both resilient and able to do a bit of damage. So if you're taking a tyrant that's all combat, then you're straight away limiting yourself, because unlike shooting where you can have quite a bit of control, combat, we don't have any way to go 3d6 charge. Yes, we've got ways of making slightly more reliable. We can go up to an 8-inch charge, we can re-roll that, that's not bad, but you're still not guaranteed. With shooting, on the whole, you're almost always going to be shooting. Because you're always going to be shooting, then you're taking part in that round of the game. If you go all combat, potentially you're just taking part in a psychic phase and the movement phase. You want these tyrants to be really dominating the game in every phase. So don't take an all-out combat tyrant. As much as it might be tempting, don't take it. Take the minimum, take a 50-50, or take an all-shooty tyrant. That's my advice, and that's what I would definitely be going with in a competitive build. If you're playing with your buddies and you're playing friendly, then by all means take a combat tyrant, but I don't see why you would very often. So that's your shooty. The other shooty option I want to talk about, and I'm not going to talk about the big heavy guns, I'm not going to talk about the Strangleform cannon, I'm not going to talk about the heavy venom cannon. Now they are great options, but I wouldn't put them on your tyrants personally. If you're going to take those, take them on your harpies, or take them predominantly on your cheap and cheerful Carnifexes. So I'm not going to talk about them. As I said, this is advanced tactics, and this is probably, we want to talk about more your competitive builds. But the other option I would consider Death Spitters. So when I run my tyrants, I like one with a Death Spitter, and I like him with a Death Spitter because when you've got a lot of tyrants, you're deep striking them all in, potentially you might have to put them all in one small area because your opponent's been smart, he's bubble wrapped, he's screened you out with scouts or Nurglings, and you might be restricted to one area of the deployment zone. Potentially then your ranges of your guns, your 18s, maybe once you've killed 1 or 2 units that you can get to easily, you're starting to run out of range. Those Death Spitters with a 24-inch range will start to give you that extra bit of threat range, and that really works fantastically well, because you'll be surprised when you're spamming tyrants and you've got quite a few in your enemy's face, you're running out of range, and suddenly, again, we're talking about participating, about playing in every single phase. You do not want any of your tyrants hanging out in the wind and not shooting, particularly as maybe they're blocked by other tyrants and they're not going to charge. Now they're not participating in 2 rounds in 2 phases of the game. So by taking Death Spitters, you are then chipping in, you're helping and you're supporting your other tyrants, and you're putting pressure on your opponent. And on top of that, the Death Spitters give you something else, and that is a little bit extra sting. Now they're less shots, so if you just take one set of Death Spitters, you're only shooting with 6 shots. If you're taking 2 sets, and again that means you're compromising all your combat ability, you're taking 12 shots. But that's 12 shots at strength 7 with a -1. Now that's really good, because those medium armoured tanks that are toughness 7, suddenly you're wounding them on a 4 rather than a 5. That's not bad. Stacked with that -1, they're going to save a lot less. So it is a sweet spot, and the tacticians and the maths guys out there will tell you you don't take them because you want to take those Devourers, because of the weight of shots, they're almost always statistically better. But I'm going to tell you differently, guys. I'm going to tell you on the table, those Death Spitters combined with those Devourers do a really solid job. So try it out next time. Proxy it. I know a lot of people don't have Death Spitters on their Tyrants because a lot of them are moving in from 7th edition. But I'm going to tell you guys, I think they're really good, and I think there is definitely a call to have at least maybe one of those Tyrants as an all-out Death Spitter Tyrant. I think you'll get a lot of value from it. I really do. So don't underestimate the Death Spitters. I think it's a good addition in a Tyrant heavy list. So that's the other gun option I want to cover. And then we talked about the combat. I would potentially think about giving one of your Tyrants a Lash Rip and Bone Sword, so you can change it into the Reaper of Obliterex. Again, it's a relic, it's free. If you've already got a relic in your army, then you can spend a CP and get an additional one and take that Reaper of Obliterex. It just means that actually with a stack from Toxin Sacks, you can do like 8 damage on a 6. So it's really crazy, and it can really then be your answer at dealing with a big threat on the board. You can take those adrenal glands, dash in there, potentially re-rolling charges, which again we'll talk about the Hive fleets in a second. But you're piling on that damage with him, and that's great. And because it is the it replaces a Lash Whip and Bone Sword, you're always striking with it. So that's something not to be underestimated. So potentially look at taking one of those in for that. Other than that, you'd be taking the Monstrous Rending Claws. You're never taking Talons. Talons are way overcosted for what they do. Your claws, your Monstrous Rending Claws are almost always better. Almost always better. Okay, so we talked a little bit about shooting. We talked a little bit about combat. Now, let's talk a little bit about the psychic powers before we then go into what is probably a key thing, is picking your Hive fleet. But let's talk a little bit about the psychic powers and how you kit these guys out. So we're assuming you've got a few of these, because that's kind of the idea of the kind of Tyrant army, and about, you know, playing Hive Tyrants. You probably want a few. You want minimum 2, probably more minimum 3, if I'm being brutally honest, but you're probably looking maybe quite a few more than that. So, psychic powers. Dominion, you're not worrying about. You know, you're probably, your build with your Tyrants is the Tyrants are nowhere near your little bugs, probably, and they've got that extended synapse, so you know you don't need to worry about it. You're not taking that. Onslaught, not a bad one, but it won't come into effect when you're straight down, but it will potentially come into effect those later rounds where you do then want to start to really move those Tyrants at speed, cover some serious amount of ground. That's when that Onslaught is going to be really, really effective. The Horror I absolutely love. The Horror's great because potentially if this is the one that you pin on that really scary unit that you're doing a bit of a Hail Mary round on, you know that you're kind of throwing all your eggs in one basket. You need to deal with this killy, nasty unit, or otherwise it's going to cause you trouble next turn. It's really going to start to put the hurt on your Tyrants. So by doing the Horror, what you can do is you can target that unit that's going to cause you trouble, suddenly make it a lot less effective, make it -1 to hit, make it in combat and in shooting. Suddenly those Tyrants, you're then stacking those odds even more. So that Tyrant before that was already pre-survivable, now you're making him even more survivable. That worked really, really effectively. So the Horror I like to take on at least a couple. I think that's very, very good. Paroxysm, okay, not too bad. I like to think you've got quite a lot of control with these Tyrants, so potentially the charge, the striking first, or the opponent are obviously striking last. I don't think it comes into play as much. I don't tend to put too many. Maybe I'll stick one on just because it's a trick that potentially is handy, particularly if you've got a killer unit again that you want to kind of target, that you want to neuter and stop it from really causing you trouble. Paroxysm's not a bad one to have, but probably just a one Tyrant might carry that around. Now Cyclic Scream I love. Cyclic Scream really helps with our whole anti-psycho meta. We're really going to cut down any psychic going on in the opponent, really stop them from really pumping up and doing damage, and this is great. Now it's situational because majority of the time it's just another smite, but every now and again you can start causing some trouble and start getting some psychers to forget powers. And what also it does is it plants a little seed of fear in your opponent. You know, you're explaining what your psychic powers are at the beginning of the game. You're telling them, right, I've got the Horror, I'm going to reduce your guys' weapon skill, ballistic skill. I've got Paroxysm, you know, you're going to be attacking me last. I've got Cyclic Scream, that Farseer, he's going to forget his powers. Now the reality is, if you're playing a smart player, which we're kind of assuming you are, they'll quite easily make sure that you're not going to be getting Cyclic Scream off on their key characters. But, you know, Demons, particularly Demons of Tzeentch, they're going to have a lot of psychers. You're definitely going to cause a little bit of fear on them with that. So the Cyclic Scream I think is good. You want it on potentially multiples, because if anything it just gives you a second smite, it gives you a second opportunity to do mortal wounds. But the big one, the key one, the magic is the Catalyst. It's an old favourite. It's not quite as good as it was in the last edition because it only affects 1 rather than 2 units, but Catalyst, giving your guys a 5-up after save, so a 5-up feel no pain for those 7th edition guys, but basically that's is a must. And again, you could almost argue to have Catalyst on every single Tyrant, and the reason to do that, because I know people are screaming and tearing their hair out and saying, well, you can only cast one, you can only cast a power once unless it's Smite, and that's absolutely correct. But these Tyrants are going to die. They're going to die. You've got to accept that you will lose 1, 2, 3, however many throughout the game. The reality is they're soaking up a lot of damage, which is making you win the game, and they're doing damage back. But you're going to lose them eventually. So, so by having Catalyst on every single one, or majority of them, means that as these Tyrants drop, you're not losing your key power to keep your Tyrants survivable. And this one, more than anything, you want to put on your Warlord Tyrant, if your Tyrant is a Warlord, which probably will be, for other reasons that, again, we will go into in a minute. So just having that power is really crucial to your game plan, because it's making that Tyrant just so much more survivable. Having a 5-up for mortal wounds, having a 5-up after you've taken that 4-up invuln is incredibly powerful. So the way that I build them, let's say for a minute we're just taking 3, take them all with Catalyst, take 2 with Cyclic Scream, and take 1 with the Horror. That's how I would build it. But you can do a variation with different ones, but I would say take them all with Catalyst. That's just how I would do it. If I'm running multiples of 4, 5, 6, 7 Tyrants, I'm having at least half of my Tyrants with Catalyst. At least half. So that's your psychic powers. Now what we'll do now is we'll just drop in and talk a little bit about the relics. We've covered one, and I'm not going to go into the ones that I don't particularly rate, but we will talk about some of the other little handy little tricks that you can take. So first one I want to talk about is the Norm Crown. The Norm Crown is just a great little thing. Again, it just makes that synapse just massively huge. So you're just going to keep control of your little guys. It's something you can pretty much forget about, but the speed of these Tyrants means you're not really worrying about that instinctive behaviour. So, it doesn't do anything crazy exciting. It doesn't jump off the page and say this is amazing. But actually, if you've got quite a few CPs and you're not using something in your backfield with this, which is more often not what you would do, but it's not a bad one to have on your Tyrants. So I'd consider a Norm Crown. Particularly if you have got little guys that are coming up around your Tyrants, which you might well do. This means that it doesn't really matter what side of the board they are, you're going to have a pretty good synapse web on them. The other one I want to talk about is the Chameleon Ik Mutation, and this is a Kraken relic, but it's very, very good on your Tyrants. And Kraken is great on your Tyrants anyway, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you take this one, and the model is, and your opponents subtract 1 from all their ranged weapons when targeting the model. So that's great. That's really, really good. That gives you basically your -1, which is fantastic. Very, very, very powerful. It's great. And what that will do is that, I believe, yes, I'm pretty sure, that is one of the only things that we have that will stack with the Malanthrope's -1 to hit, because it's a completely different rule. So this one, amazing if you want a Tyrant to start in your deployment zone with a Malanthrope, with all his goodness. You maybe pop off the psychic power as well to give him a feel no pain. They can shoot their army at him and he's probably surviving. So the great little one there. I really, really like that. If you go in Kraken, you're going to have that relic every single time. You put it on your Warlord, magic, magic, absolutely awesome. But as I said, the one you want to be taking is the Reaper of Obliterex. It is an absolute awesome, awesome relic, and it just makes that Tyrant that much more killy. I'm not going to go into all the other ones. The other ones, a lot of them you can put on a Tyrant, a lot of them you can, are good, but on the whole, they're the 3 that you want to be looking at. And of course, guys, if you've had a lot of luck with one of them, chuck it in. I always like hearing what you've got to say. So, where should we go first? Stratagems, or let's talk about the Hive fleets? Let's talk about the Hive fleets, because this is really, really important. And a lot of these don't necessarily affect your Tyrants, or particularly because we're running flying Hive Tyrants. They're not. So, and again, I'm not going to focus in on every single one. I'm going to talk about the few that you would potentially consider, and the ones that I would go for, and the ones that I would advise. So the 4 Hive fleets that I would recommend is Behemoth, Kraken, Leviathan, and Chronos. And those 4 Hive fleets will also be probably your strongest, full stop anyway. They're the ones you're more or less going to be going for. Jormungandr is great. I think it's really, really good and one of my favourites, but it doesn't really help your flying Hive Tyrants particularly. Because they're too mobile. They're too mobile, it's not really going to affect them. And in fact, it doesn't affect flying units anyway, so almost ignore me. But the Jormungandr, great Hive fleet, but for your flying Hive Tyrants, it's not one for you. It's going to do nothing for you whatsoever. But the others will. So let's start off at the top and talk a bit about Behemoth and why you would take that. So this is when you're going to be making sure that you're building multiple mixed combat and shooting units. And what the Behemoth one does is it gives you reroll to charge. And that's really powerful. Those odds are then just going up so much more that you're going to get in there. And that's what you probably want to be doing quite often, because with the Tyrants you're not necessarily expecting to kill stuff, but you're just getting in there, tying up, making them back off you, stopping them from shooting, whatever it might be. It's a great tactic. You're stacking that with those adrenal glands. It's pretty reliable. An 8 with a reroll is not bad at all. Really quite like that. So that's one definitely to consider with a Tyrant heavy army. I'd be looking at that. It's not one that I've run currently. I'm probably depending more on my shooting, so I'm not as worried about that, but it's a great one to go for 100% and will make you a lot more reliable. Kraken. Now, the reason why Kraken is so good is Kraken allows you to fall back and then a charge again. Now, bearing in mind that our Tyrants are flying Hive Tyrants, so they can shoot anyway when they fall back, but now they can recharge. So what you've got now is a real nuisance, and you've got something that can be continuously jumping over units, really getting in your opponent's deployment zone and causing issues. Stack that with the fact that now you can take that relic that we spoke about and you've got a great combination for your Tyrants. I really like Kraken, and I think Kraken is one of the best ones to go with. 100%, really like it. Would recommend giving it a go. Now I'm going to talk about Chronos. Chronos one is one that doesn't leap out of the page straight away, because on paper, when we're looking at it right here, you're thinking, actually, this does nothing for my Tyrants. So basically what Chronos does, its core ability, is it rerolls ones when it doesn't move in the shooting phase. So these Tyrants are dropping down, so that counts as them moving. They're moving forward all the time because they're moving around and shooting. They're very, very rarely ever making the most of that rerolling ones for shooting. So from that, it means nothing whatsoever. But what it does mean, that we can then make use of both the Warlord trait, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and the Stratagem, which we'll talk about in a minute. And those two Chronos tactics, paired with the fact that we have the Shadow and the Warp, which again we can talk a little bit about, means that the Chronos is great, because psychic powers are hugely important in the game, and being able to shut your opponent out casting their key psychic powers is almost worth sacrificing everything else for, because particularly when we're talking about combating Eldar, who are very dependent on getting those psychic powers off to make their Dark Reapers, whatever it is, really, really powerful, you having the ability to reliably shut them down is so powerful. And because the Tyrants are in such an advanced position on the board, you can do that and do it reliably, and you will really counter your opponent's tactics. So Chronos, even though not shouting at you off the page, is one that often you want to be looking at. And dare I say it, that's where the mixed Tyrants come in, when you're building multiple detachments. Now, love it or hate it, we're talking about real kind of competition and competitive builds here. Not everybody likes to mix Hive fleets, and I get it. It's not lovely. It kind of it does stink from a fluff point of view, but from a tactics point of view, it's probably the most solid way to build your army, to have at least one Chronos in there just to interfere and cause trouble. Okay, so then we're going to talk about the last Hive fleet that I want to focus on, and that is the Leviathan Hive fleet. And this is the one that recently I've been trialling with, and actually is very, very good. Again, it's a maths one. It's one that actually you just have to kind of write on a bit of paper and you kind of work it out. It's one that necessarily, again, doesn't jump off the page. And what it is basically is let's cut all the rubbish away, because your Tyrants are synapse creatures. Basically, they get a 6-up feel no pain built in. So you've basically built your Tyrant an extra couple of wounds on average throughout a game. Now for me, that never comes up because I never roll those key 6s when I'm making that second save, but statistically you're building more wounds into your Tyrants, so you're making your Tyrants that much more survivable, particularly when you've got multiples of them. You're making your opponent work that much harder to bring these guys down. So it's probably, for the majority of your Tyrants, the better way to go, because what the key tactic for Tyrants is they just need to survive. They need to survive as long as possible, because they just apply pressure. They apply pressure, they hold board space, and they will win the game for everything else that's left on the board while they're doing damage. If they're dying too quickly, your tactic's out the window from the start. So Leviathan is probably your overriding best one to go for, but I would definitely... You want to be keying it in with Chronos. It's really important, and you could go with Kraken. There's some arguments to say that Kraken is great as well. So there you kind of the 3 key ones, but I wouldn't underestimate the ability of going Behemoth. So the way I go with Chronos, and I chuck in some Leviathan. That's how I go. So not many Chronos, maybe 1, 2 Chronos, and then the rest of them I go with Leviathan. The Chronos ones, I make sure one of them's always casting the Catalyst, so you've then got 6 up on a lot of them, and then you've got the 5 up on the other one. So that works really, really well for me, and give it a go. But obviously if you're a purist and you want to stick to one Hive fleet, I totally respect you, I salute you. You are bosses. And then probably Leviathan is your safe bet, but maybe give Chronos a go just for those anti-psych. And if you know who you're playing, if you know that your local meta is heavy psychic, take the Chronos without a doubt. It's just going to win you the game so much. Right, okay, so we've talked a little bit about the Hive fleets, we've talked a little bit about weapons, we've talked a little bit about relics. I'll quickly touch on the Warlord Traits before we go into Stratagems, which are probably one of your key things you need to take into account. So Warlord Traits, and again, there's lots here, lots that will help you out, but I just want to focus on one in particular, and of course you guys can chat in the comments and talk about ones that have worked really, really well for you, but I want to talk particularly about Chronos and about the soul hunger. So this is where the magic comes in. So whenever an enemy psyker fails a psychic test within 18 inches of your warlord, they suffer D3 mortal wounds. Now that is really, for a start, that is really scaring your opponent, because a lot of their psykers are support units. So they're warlocks, they're heralds, they're little imperial psykers with not that many wounds. So when they're suffering D3 mortal wounds when they fail a psychic test, that's really making them second guess what they're going to use. So these guys suddenly are not smiting you if they need to use a key power, because they can't afford to be failing. They can't be afford to just be throwing dice for the hell of it, because it's too dangerous. So this is really second guessing your opponent, really making sure that you're playing those mind games, which is great for Tyranids. It really plays to our fluff. You know, we're really just getting in their heads. We're really taking control, and I love that. So this one for me is, I like to have it every single time. I just think it's great. More often than not, your opponent will have a psyker. Psykers are so prevalent in the game. it's great. You will find every now and again you come across an army that just doesn't have any psychic backing at all. When that happens, you know, you can obviously change it up, but that's the way I go. I always tend to go with it. I just stick to it, I like it, it works. Right, and as I said, loads of other good ones in there, but for this video I want to focus in what really works and what I think is really the magic, so you guys have got some ideas to go away and play with. So let's talk about stratagems, and what is really good. And again, there's loads of good stuff in here, loads of stuff that will work, but I want to focus on a couple of ones, and I'm going to find them for you. So if I can find the right one. Right, so I'm going to start off with Rapid Regeneration. It's one not to forget. Rapid Regeneration, basically you use it at the end of your movement phase, and you can select a tyranid model and it can regain D3 mortal wounds. Now it's 2 CPs, it's not cheap, but it's really good at topping up those tyrants. Now, a good buddy of mine was playing my list, in fact, and made a very good point, and actually it's something to really consider and to take into account. Don't necessarily just put this on your tyrant that's going to die. That current tyrant's going to die, you know, getting an extra wound or an extra couple of wounds is probably not going to be the end of the world, unless you, like, this is last gasp and you've got one left or something, fair enough. But if you've got multiple tyrants, accept the fact that tyrant's going, but what is great is to top up your tyrants that are probably on 10, 11 wounds, really to get them back up, right up to the top, back up to almost full strength or full strength. That's where it's great, because you're just telling your opponent, well, you know, you've done no damage to that tyrant, he's back to full life, and that works really well. Of course, it's a key one for your warlord. Keep your warlord alive, particularly if you're playing missions where you can get slay the warlord, which quite often you are. It's a great one to chuck on your warlord, particularly you've done that to him, then you're going to give him catalyst, so you're making him more survivable again, which is a great thing. So the next one I want to talk about is Pathogenic Slime. Now again, 2 CPs, but this is really strong, and basically, so you use it, you can only use it on a monster, so obviously it's working great for our tyrants, and you can increase the damage of its attacks for that phase. So obviously shooting attacks we can use it for, and you can increase the damage by 1. And that's amazing for your double devourers. So these double devourers that are doing 24 shots are suddenly doing 2 damage each. So we're shooting this at your elite troops, so at the bikes, whatever it might be, suddenly, you know, Primus Marines, you're doing ridiculous amounts of damage. You're just making it, every save they fail, it's hurting them so much. So I really like that one. 2 CPs is quite expensive, but wow, it can be so effective. I really rate it. So definitely would be looking at using that one quite often. And then I go into probably my favourite. My favourite is Death Frenzy. I love Death Frenzy, and I would be using it on your tyrants every single game. This is the one that really you should have. This is such an ace up your sleeve. I can't stress enough. This is so good. So at 2 CP, Death Frenzy means use a stratagem when a tyranid character from your army is slain. So basically when your Hive Tyrant's dead, and then you can do 1 last attack. So you can immediately either shoot as if it was the shooting phase, or fight as if it was the fighting phase before being removed from the battle. And this is so powerful. Again, 2 CPs, but wow, this is great. And I'll tell you what, this is so cool. This is great because that little unit potentially that's then moved up to try and do that damage to that Tyrant, that Scion unit that's dropped in with its melters, that's that like Suicide Squad in, you know, you haven't even got to worry about it in your next shooting phase because your Tyrant's killed it just as it dies. That's crazy good. If it's in combat, you know, potentially, you know, you're getting that opportunity to slay that whatever it is before you die. You know, on top of the fact you've got your normal death throws, which you're potentially doing mortal wounds as it is, Death Frenzy just adds to that, and you'll be into such a pain. You know, you're that Tyrant that they've put everything in to kill. You'll suddenly get an opportunity to either shoot or assault with it again. I'd be using it every single time one of your Tyrants dies. Obviously, you can only do it once a phase, but still, if you've got the CPs, this is such a key stratagem and one you should be making full use from your Tyrants. Use it in every game. Smile as your Tyrant dies, as he does his last bit of damage. Now I'll put a little bit of controversy at the end of this one. Now the controversy I'm going to give you, and I'd love to hear your comments, and I'm sure people will be, as always, because this is the internet, be absolutely, this is how you do it, this is how you do it. And that's fine, but I just want to talk a little bit about logic here, guys. So what profile you shoot in is kind of your choice, because there is no profile for 0 wounds. Now some people will say, well actually you were on 1 wound before, so you must be on the lowest tier. Well, that's not the case, because they're still tiered. You have got no wounds, what tier do you shoot on? Maybe that damage, that last damage, well that massive bit of damage had taken you down 2 tiers before you died. Does that mean you shoot on top tier? It's something that you need to think about, guys. I would say that, you know, in the interest of fairness, maybe shoot or attack at the middle tier. But, you know, look, you can absolutely argue either way, and I'm sure you will, guys, in the chat below. So please do let me know what you think. I tend to do it in the middle, but there's a very strong argument to say that you could do it as top tier or as bottom tier. It's completely, it's up to you to decide with your opponent. I would say it needs an FAQ. I've not seen one, but again, maybe I'm wrong. If there is an FAQ, let us know. So, they're the key, I would say. They are the key stratagems. You have also, if I can find it on here. So, what you also have is the same as you have in pretty much every single codex, which is the ability to fight again. It's 3 CPs. It might be really important. It's one definitely never to forget, particularly if you are taking maybe the Reaper of Obliterex Tyrant, and you know you really kill something big. It's probably worth it then. A lot of the time, 3 CP is just a little bit expensive, and you're probably not playing to that. So, but it's one to keep up your sleeve because it's always worth doing. So they're the only ones I'm gonna. Oh, actually, before I go, I will actually talk about. I will talk about one other one. The last one I'm going to talk about, again going back to that Chronos strength of Anti-Psyker, is the Deepest Shadow. Now the Deepest Shadow is a stratagem basically where any Psyker attempts to manifest a power within 24 inches of a Chronos unit. So it doesn't have to be the Tyrant, but it's more than likely going to be your Chronos Tyrant. Your opponent can only roll a single dice for that psychic test. Now bear in mind, because they're more likely in the Shadow of the Warp as well, they're already -1, there are quite a lot of powers that they actually won't be able to cast. So those killer ones, like remove your Invon save, you know, that kind of warp time, you're potentially making those opponents just no way of casting it. So I've played Magnus and even completely shut him down with that power, and he gets like +2 to his psychic powers. So you know, it's so good, it's unreal. You've got to be very quick with it. You know, you have to be quick, and your opponent will try and play on that a little bit, particularly when they get hit by it first turn. They will be trying to rush through that psychic phase. They'll be like, right, I'm going to cast that, dice down, and off they go. You can't stop it at that point, but you know, because you have to do it as they nominate to do that power. So they'll go, I'm going to cast that before they roll it. You crack the stratagem, you can only roll 1 dice, fella. But you know, you got to be careful with it, because I've had already a couple of disputes where they'll go, yeah, I'm not actually going to cast that, and I'm go, well actually hang on a minute, you've just said you're going to cast it, but I've not rolled any dice. So be careful with that one. It is open to a little bit of dispute, let's say, but a very powerful stratagem and one always to be using when really cutting out those key Eldar and Chaos Psychic powers that are so important to their tactics. So we've talked about all the stratagems, we've talked about weapons, we've talked about everything really about the Tyrant, how you build that Tyrant. So now let's end the video by talking a little bit about you've got all the pieces to the jigsaw. Now how do you put them together? How do you make this list? How do you work with these Tyrants? So let's start off with volume of Tyrants. So we've kind of skirted around the subject a little bit, but how many Tyrants do you take? Okay, so I think, and this is personal opinion, I think you want to be taking a minimum of 4 Tyrants in a Tyrant based list. Any less than that, and they are support units, they are units that are doing a job, but you're probably not playing the game around them. You want to be taking 4. So for me, 4 then gives you ability to go 2 mixed and 2 very shooty. That's what I would go as a minimum. So if you're kind of just latching onto this and you're like, right, I'm going to play Tyrants, I want to play a Tyrant heavy army, I want to base my tactics around these Tyrants, that's your starting point. You have 4. You have 2 double shooty, and to be honest, if you're going with 4, I'd still probably stick to all Devourers. Don't worry with the Death Spitters. For me, you introduce that after 5. So you go with 2 double, so it's 24 shots each. 2 with monstrous Rending Claws, and 1 set of Devourers each. Potentially one of them you might want to take the Reaper on. It's something to play with. Not essential, but maybe worth playing with. But otherwise, again, and if you keep it cheaper, you know, go with his Rending Claws. So there's your build. That's doing your damage. That's then able to participate in every round of every phase in the game. It's going to take a lot to deal with. I would take one of those in a Chronos detachment mixed with maybe another HQ or another couple of HQs. I would take the other 3 in a Supreme Command detachment, and I would take them all as Leviathan. Then what you've got is you've got your Chronos one, you're making sure you get Catalyst as an important every turn on that, and then the other 3 have got your built-in 6 up. So that's your start build. So that's your start build, and that will work really, really well. You've then got the ability to build a whole other list. You're not necessarily fixed with that's your only tactic, but that's your key game winner. That's the Tyrants are going to be really applying that pressure, doing those smites, doing those psychic screams, really causing trouble in your opponent's face, while your other armies may be putting out some shooting, or your Gene Stealers are advancing and causing grief, you know, whatever it might be. You've still got an opportunity to build other things in there, but that is the start of your real Tyrant list. Now let's go on. So then you're going to build a little bit, you're enjoying that and you want to build a bit more Tyrants in there because you see the magic of what those Tyrants are. I would then look at building a 5 or a 6 list. I really like the 6 list, because for me the 6 list, then what you do is you pop in, so you've got your 2 combat ones. I would then run with 3 shooty double Devourer ones, then you've got a crazy amount of shooting there, and then I'd stick in a Death Spitter one. So you've still just got 2 really combat ones, but then you've just got so much shooting, but you've still got combat ability in there. That's the way that I would go. That's my 6 build. But what you can do is really play when you've got 6. So you can play around and kind of mix it with shooting, combat, find out what balance works with you. For me, the game is very shooty. That's where the magic happens, and actually those Tyrants that are not combat orientated at all will still do a good job at irritating and tying up tanks and just being a general nuisance. And because they got fly, that's never going to stop them from shooting. So that's the way that I build it on a 6. If you go to a 7, and it's a great tactic to go to 7, you're now really, really playing the spam game, and you're really, really optimising that Tyrant army to the max. I would then make sure you throw in the 7th as a combat one, so then you've got 3 combat Tyrants. So you've got, well, I say combat Tyrants, you've got them with the Rending Claws, and you've got them with the Devourers. I would still make sure, I would always have a Death Spitter one in there, again just through that range bit, a little bit of Toughness 7, and I think that works really, really well for you. You can squeeze in an 8th. I don't think you can squeeze in a 9 to any list that's actually realistic. You could just about squeeze in an 8th. If you go at 8th, again, you've probably got enough shooting by that point, so again you want to be going a Rending Claw and a Devourer with that, and that's going to work really, really, really well for you. So give it a go. I mean, if you have tried 8 Tyrants, I'd be really, really interested to hear. I've not heard anyone doing particularly well with 8 Tyrants, but I've not heard many people playing it, so it's probably out there. 7 is doing very, very well at the moment. It's, you know, a couple of the really top players have been playing that, and they've been winning tournaments with it. I like 6. I really like 6. I'm probably going to try 7. My spin on things is probably slightly different from some of the competitive armies. I like my brigades. They're not based so much around brigades. They're more based around just kind of spamming those tyrants and getting units out there that are not going to give away points, which works very, very well. I like the brigade because I think all those stratagems that we spoke about, I want to be maxing them out every single turn and making full use of them. Most of those stratagems are 2 CP each. If you've not built a brigade in, and particularly as tyrannids don't easily have a way to get those stratagems back, get those CPs back. I think you want to have a lot built in so you can really maximise the ability of those tyrants to hit hard every single phase. So that's the way that I like to run them. I like to run them in mixed into a brigade at least, to get the maximum CPs. But yeah, so 7 probably doesn't do that so much, but 7's working really, really well, and 7 is probably optimising those tyrants to the absolute fullest, and that's the competitive build at the moment. My recommendation is 6. That would be my take on it. I think 6 gives you slightly more ability to build slight more variety in your list, and gives you something that if someone, and what will happen now Hive Tyrants are really becoming a flavour and becoming a real thing, and starting to shape the meta to a degree. People will come up with counters for them, and you will get that, and that's going to happen, and you have to be able to adapt and deal with the counters. But if you've gone all out tyrant spam and you've gone 7 rather than slightly less and gone 6 to give yourself something else to play with, you're all eggs in one basket, and if someone opens the key to how to unlock that, you're just down. You're down and out for the count. So I think 6 is the magic for me. It gives you slight more variety, but look, 7 at the moment is what's doing the business. So, you know, find your balance, and actually maybe if 6 is too many, knock it down to 5. Try the 4. Once you get under the 4, you're no longer playing the Hive Tyrant game. They're just a part of your mixed army, which is absolutely fine, which is very, very cool. But you'd probably be looking at the 4 to 7 is where your army then revolves around those tyrants. So we've talked a lot in detail, guys. It's been a long video, and hopefully you've taken something out and you can go away and start to really think about how you're going to work these tyrants in. They're an incredibly powerful unit. They are probably the best unit in the game, in the Tyranid Codex, and one of the best in the game. All you guys that played a lot of Tyrant spam in 7th edition, please fear not. These guys work so differently now. Yes, there's a lot of shooting. You might think on paper it feels the same. These guys interact in the game so much. There's so many tricks, there's so many different things you can do with them. They are not one-dimensional, they really aren't, and because of that, they're a lot of fun to play. I was very reluctant to go back to playing Tyrant Spam. I got so sick and tired and bored of playing it in 7th, but I'm telling you guys, it plays very differently, it's very fun, it's very varied, it's very flexible. So give it a go, let me know how you think. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I will be back with some more advanced Tyranid tactics very soon. Again, please do hit the like, comment, it helps me loads to hear what you guys think, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.